A fisherman pulls a bottle from the depths. Inside, a single, cryptic warning: do not look at the moon today. He laughs, thinking it's a foolish prank. But that night, when he looks up at the sky, he sees it's not the moon at all. It's a colossal, watching eye. And just as he realizes his mistake, it slowly blinks. The waves licked at the hull of the old boat, hungry tongues tasting the salt-cured wood. It was a sound that had been the lullaby and the alarm of his entire life. Jan, a fisherman whose hands were a testament to his trade, a roadmap of deep lines, faded scars, and the permanent stain of fish blood, pulled at the heavy net with an ache that started in his knuckles and settled deep in his shoulders. The gray sky pressed down, merging with the gray sea until the horizon was a meaningless smudge. The air tasted of brine and the cold promise of an empty evening, a scent he knew better than any other. With a final grunt, he hauled the net over the gunwale, its meager contents spilling onto the deck with a wet slap. A pathetic tangle of seaweed, a few crabs that scuttled for cover, and nothing more. Yet something heavy remained caught in the mesh, something that rolled with a solid, unnatural thud against the planks. It was a bottle, its glass so dark a green it was almost black, clouded by its long slumber in the deep. A colony of small barnacles had made it their home, and the neck was sealed shut not with a simple cork, but with a thick, ominous plug of blackened wax, stamped with a sigil he couldn't recognize. He set the net aside, a flicker of curiosity cutting through his weariness. Using the worn tip of his bait knife, he chipped away at the stubborn wax seal. It crumbled like ancient earth, revealing the bottle's dark mouth. Inside, a tightly rolled scroll of paper rattled faintly. He tilted the bottle, and the message slid into his calloused palm. It was not paper, but something more like parchment, brittle and yellowed with age, so thin in places he could almost see through it. His fingers, clumsy from a lifetime of mending nets, carefully unrolled the fragile scroll. The script was jagged, written in a faded ink the color of dried blood: do not look at the moon today. A laugh erupted from his chest, a harsh, grating sound that was swallowed by the immense silence of the sea. A joke, it had to be. The morbid humor of a drowning sailor or the drunken whim of a tourist playing at desert island fantasies. He was a man who trusted the tangible world, the pull of the tide, the weight of a full net, the sting of the wind. This message was a ghost, a whisper from a world he refused to acknowledge. For a moment, he hesitated, the fragile paper feeling strangely significant in his hand. Then, with a grunt of dismissal, he crushed it and tossed the bottle back into the water. It sank without a spectacle, a quiet gulp that seemed to pull a piece of the day's light down with it. As if on cue, the sun began to bleed into the horizon, painting the clouds in violent streaks of rust and bruised purple. The day was dying, and the air grew teeth. Jan ignored the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, grabbing his oars and settling into the familiar, back-breaking rhythm of the row home. The creak of the oarlocks was the only sound in a world that seemed to be holding its breath. He aimed the bow toward the distant pinpricks of light from his village, his thoughts turning to the simple comforts of land, never noticing the way the waves now whispered against the hull, shaping a warning he had already chosen to ignore. Evening draped itself over the coastal town like a fisherman's net, soft and full of captured shadows. Jan, returning to his shack that clung to the cliff's edge like a stubborn barnacle, felt the day's labor settle into his bones as a deep, resonant ache. The air had grown still, the cries of the gulls replaced by the rhythmic sigh of the surf against the rocks below. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who has performed the same tasks for a lifetime, securing his boat before making the climb up the winding dirt path, the scent of the low tide following him like a loyal dog. His home was a single room, smelling of salt, wood smoke, and a faint, perpetual dampness that even the hearth's warmth could never fully banish. He lit the fire with practiced ease, the kindling catching with a soft whoosh, and the flames began their hungry dance, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed upon the rough-hewn walls. The fire was a living thing in the crushing silence of the shack, a companion whose language was crackle and hiss. It pushed back the encroaching chill of the night, but it could not touch the cold that had begun to seat itself in his mind, a lingering unease from the strange message in the bottle. He ate his meal of dried cod and stale bread without tasting it, his jaws working mechanically. The food was merely fuel, a necessity to be dealt with before sleep. But the silence in the room was different tonight. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of solitude he was accustomed to, it was a heavy, expectant stillness. A listening silence. He found his gaze drifting to the single, salt-grimed window, the memory of the scrawled words, "Do not look at the moon today," surfacing in his thoughts, as unwelcome and persistent as a splinter under a nail. He scoffed at his own foolishness, a grown man spooked by a castaway's prank. The air inside had become thick, suffocating, as if the silence itself was consuming all the oxygen. Needing to escape the feeling, to replace the oppressive quiet with the honest sound of the sea, he pushed his chair back and walked to the door. He stepped out onto the small, rickety porch, a platform of weathered planks that jutted out over the cliff's precipice. The salt spray was a refreshing shock against his skin, and he took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the cold, clean air of the night. The sky above was a vast expanse of polished obsidian, peppered with the diamond dust of 1,000 distant stars. It was a familiar, comforting sight. And then he looked up. The moon was there, as the evening had promised it would be. It hung in the sky, perfectly full, impossibly round. But something was immediately, profoundly wrong. The light it cast was not the familiar, gentle silver of a coastal night. It was a flat, clinical, bone-white glare that bleached all color from the world, rendering the rocks and the churning sea below in stark, unsettling monochrome. The shadows it threw were not soft-edged and deep, but sharp and absolute, as if cut from black paper. It was a sterile, watchful light, devoid of all warmth, all poetry. He squinted, trying to make sense of the illusion. The familiar patterns on its surface, the seas and craters he had known his entire life, seemed to shift and rearrange themselves under his very gaze. It was not a trick of the clouds, for the sky was perfectly clear. The dark, sprawling maria were no longer dusty plains, but a network of branching lines, like veins swollen with dark blood. The luminous highlands were not rock, but a pale, fibrous tissue, unnervingly organic. The shape of it, the texture, the very essence of it was changing, resolving into something his mind screamed was impossible, a truth too monstrous to accept. It was not a sphere of rock. It was an eye. A vast, unblinking orb, suspended in the void, its sclera luminous, sickly white, crisscrossed by the terrifying web of gray veins that seemed to pulse with a slow, silent rhythm. And at its center, where the sea of tranquility should have been, was a pupil. A perfect circle of absolute blackness, a hole punched through the fabric of the night that seemed to drink the starlight around it. It was a bottomless abyss, and Jan felt an vertiginous pull, as if his own soul were being drawn out of him and into that terrible void. He was a fly caught in the gaze of a cosmic spider, utterly, hopelessly transfixed. His breath hitched in his throat, a dry, useless gasp. His heart, which had been a steady drumbeat against his ribs his entire life, became a frantic, terrified hammering. Every muscle in his body locked, frozen in a rictus of pure, primal fear. He was no longer a man standing on his porch, but a single point of awareness in a universe that now contained only two things, his insignificant self, and the colossal, silent observer in the sky. He could feel the gaze on him, not as light, but as a physical pressure, a weight that threatened to crush him where he stood. He was seen. He was known. And then, it blinked. Time seemed to stretch and distort as a colossal, milky white lid descended from the upper curve of the sphere. It moved with an impossible, horrifying slowness, a deliberate and conscious action that annihilated any lingering hope that this was a dream or a hallucination. There was no sound, only a profound, internal sensation of displacement, a silent rush of cosmic wind that swept through his mind. The lid met its lower half, plunging the world into an absolute, starless black for a single, eternal moment before retracting with the same dreadful, measured pace, revealing the eye once more. Unchanged. Still watching. That single, silent motion shattered something deep within him. The blink was not just an observation, it was a communication. A confirmation. The moment the eye had opened again, the connection was forged. He felt the gaze pierce through his skull, no longer just looking at him, but into him. It rifled through his thoughts, his memories, the simple, quiet tapestry of his life laid bare for this celestial entity. It was an intimate violation, a psychic intrusion that left him feeling flayed open, his very consciousness a specimen under a microscope. The feeling of being watched was no longer coming from the sky, but from inside his own head. A strangled cry finally broke from his lips, and the spell of paralysis was broken. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on the doorframe, and he fell into the relative darkness of his shack, scrambling away from the door like a crab scuttling from a predator. He slammed the wooden door shut and fumbled for the iron bolt, sliding it home with a loud, metallic clang that seemed pathetically inadequate. It was a child's defense, a flimsy shield against a monster that could blot out the stars. He pressed his back against the rough wood, his body trembling uncontrollably. But the walls offered no protection. The malevolent, white light of the eye seeped through the cracks around the door and the window, carving sharp, geometric lines into the interior darkness. The familiar shadows cast by the dying fire no longer danced, they cowered, pinned in place by the terrible, unblinking glare. He could still feel it, a focused point of pressure on the back of his neck, a phantom touch that burned like a brand. He was marked. He had looked, and in looking, he had been seen. The connection was a leash, and he was now tethered to the monstrous eye in the sky, a prisoner in his own home, in his own mind. Dawn did not break, it seeped into the world, a weak, gray watercolor wash that did little to dispel the shadows clinging to the corners of Jan's shack. Sleep had been a stranger to him, leaving him to wrestle with the night's impossible memory. He had spent the hours staring into the embers of the fire, tracing the impossible image of the celestial eye onto the canvas of his mind until it was more real than the wooden walls around him. With the first hint of light, he had stumbled to the window, his heart a frantic bird in his chest, and looked at the sky. It was a blank slate of overcast cloud, indifferent and empty. There was no eye. Only the familiar, oppressive gray. A part of him, the rational fisherman who knew the moods of the sea and the turn of the tide, clung to this mundane reality. It had been a dream, a waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and the strange discovery in the bottle. A trick of the moonlight on the clouds, magnified by solitude and an overactive imagination. He repeated these explanations to himself, the words a hollow catechism against a terror that still coiled in his gut. The only cure for such phantoms was the solid, chaotic world of other people. He had to go to the market. He had to immerse himself in the noise and bustle of ordinary life until the madness of the night was washed away. He walked the path to the town square, his steps heavier than usual. The air was cool and damp, carrying the familiar sense of salt, drying nets, and the distant promise of baking bread. These were the smells of his life, the anchors of his reality, and he drew them in deeply, trying to force the nocturnal horror out of his lungs. The market was already a swirling eddies of humanity. Fishermen haggled over the price of the morning's catch, their voices a gruff and lively chorus. Women with baskets on their arms moved from stall to stall, their chatter weaving a complex tapestry of gossip and commerce. Children darted through the crowd, their shrieks of laughter like sparks of light in the gray morning. For a while, it worked. Jan let the familiar chaos wash over him, a comforting tide of normalcy. He watched Marta, the baker's wife, her arms dusted with flour as she arranged loaves of bread. He saw old Thomas mending a net, his gnarled fingers moving with a slow, practiced grace. These were the people he had known his entire life, their faces and habits as predictable as the seasons. Nothing was out of place. The world was as it should be. The eye had been a figment, a fever dream. A profound sense of relief began to settle in his chest, so potent it was almost dizzying. He allowed himself a small, shaky smile. Then he saw it. A subtle discord in the market symphony. An old man, known for his stall of fresh snails, was absently polishing a shell. Across the square, a young mother, bouncing a fretful baby on her hip, was haggling for a piece of fish. They were two separate beings, engaged in two separate lives, worlds apart in the bustling square. But then, in a single, fluid motion that was too precise to be a coincidence, both of their heads turned. Not in a sudden jerk, but with the smooth, unnerving grace of machinery, they both lifted their gaze to the same point in the overcast sky, as if answering a silent summons. Jan's blood ran cold. He stared at them, his breath catching in his throat. Their faces were blank, their eyes unfocused and empty, like the glass eyes of a doll. They were staring at the clouds, at the place where the moon, and the eye, was hidden but not gone. The moment stretched, a silent, terrifying tableau in the midst of the market's noise. It was then that a fly buzzed near Jan's face, and he blinked, a simple, involuntary reflex. Across the square, in perfect, instantaneous synchrony, the old man and the young mother both blinked. One slow, languid blink, their eyelids closing and opening as one, before their heads returned to their original positions with the same unnatural smoothness. A wave of nausea washed over January. He tore his gaze away, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was not a dream. It was real. He scanned the crowd, now with eyes wide with terror, and he saw it everywhere. It was in the small things, the gestures that should have been random but were now woven together into a horrifying pattern. A fisherman at the docks, his arm raised to throw a coiled rope, froze mid-motion. A few feet away, another fisherman, mending a different net, froze in the exact same pose, a mirror image of arrested momentum. They stood like statues for a beat, two men connected by an invisible thread. He began to back away, shouldering his way through the crowd, but the wrongness was closing in. He saw a line of women at the well, their arms working the pump handle not in a clumsy, varied rhythm, but in a perfect, unified cadence, up and down, as if they were a single, multi-limbed machine. Their movements were devoid of individual effort, stripped of all humanity. He needed to get away, to find a place to hide, to think. The air in the square suddenly felt thin, and he realized with a jolt of absolute horror that the ambient noise was fading, the individual voices and sounds dissolving. In their place, a new sound was rising. It was the sound of breathing. He stopped, rooted to the spot, and listened. The entire street, the entire market, had taken a single, collective breath. A slow, deep inhalation that seemed to pull all the air toward a central point, creating a moment of profound, vacuum-sealed silence. Then, a unified exhalation, a long, soft sigh from 100 throats at once, a sound like a great beast stirring in its sleep. The very air around him seemed to pulse with this shared life, and he, with his own ragged, frantic breaths, was a discordant note in a terrible, silent hymn. Panic finally took hold, a pure, animalistic need to flee. He turned and ran, pushing past bodies that seemed to part for him with an unnerving lack of resistance. He did not look at their faces, terrified of seeing his own fear reflected in 100 pairs of empty, synchronized eyes. He plunged into the first narrow alleyway he could find, a dark, damp fissure between two buildings that smelled of brine and decay. He pressed his back against the cold, weeping stone, his chest heaving, his mind a maelstrom of terror and disbelief. The sounds of the market were muffled here, distant. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own frantic heartbeat. He squeezed his eyes shut, but it did no good. The image of the eye was burned onto the backs of his eyelids, a ghostly afterimage that pulsed in the darkness. The feeling of being watched returned, no longer a distant pressure from the sky, but an intimate, invasive presence inside his own skull. It was a cold, alien consciousness brushing against his own, and with it came a thought, a whisper that was not formed of sound but of pure understanding, blooming in the silent chamber of his mind. "You are alone," it said, a statement of simple, undeniable fact. Then, a chilling addendum, a promise that dripped with cold, cosmic patience, but for how long? The days bled into one another, a monotonous smear of gray dawns and oppressive, silver-lit nights. Time had lost its shape, becoming a thick, viscous fluid through which Jan was forced to move. He no longer ventured to the market, he had become a ghost in his own life, a prisoner in his shack, his world shrinking to the space between four wooden walls. But from his begrimed window, he watched, and he began to see the architecture of the nightmare. It was a web, woven not of silk but of shared impulse, its strands connecting every man, woman, and child in the town, leaving him as the only creature still struggling in the empty spaces between. The town now awoke as one. There was no gentle, staggered start to the day, no lone fisherman heading out before the others. At a precise, unspoken moment just as the gray light solidified, every door in the village would open in unison. The sound, a chorus of creaking wood and scraping latches, was the first beat in the day's terrible rhythm. Then came the footsteps on the cobblestones, not a clatter of individuals, but a single, resonant tramp. 1,000 feet striking the ground as one, creating a sound that was not human, but geological, like the slow, grinding march of a glacier. From his hiding place, he would watch his neighbor, Thomas, a man whose life had once been a symphony of complaints and grumbling, emerge from his cottage. His face was a placid, empty mask. He would walk to his woodpile, lift his axe, and bring it down on a log. At the exact same instant, across the town, Jan would hear the echo, dozens of other axes striking wood in perfect, unvaried time. He once watched Thomas sit on his porch to eat a piece of bread, and his gaze drifted to the distant figure of the baker, standing in his own doorway. They chewed in perfect synchrony, a slow, rhythmic motion of jaws working in tandem across 100 yards. The children were the most horrifying. Their chaotic, unpredictable energy had been the town's most vital spark. Now, that spark was extinguished. He saw a group of them in the square, gathered around a spinning top. They were not playing. They stood in a silent circle, their heads cocked at the exact same angle, watching the toy wobble. When it finally fell, they all straightened up at once, turned, and walked away in a single, silent line. There was no laughter, no squabbling. Their childhood had been hollowed out, leaving only the husk of a shared, empty purpose. They were dolls waiting for a command. The sounds of human life had been systematically erased. The boisterous arguments of the fishermen, the high-pitched gossip of the market women, the simple songs hummed while mending nets, all gone. The air was now filled with a different sound, a low, pervasive hum that seemed to emanate not from their throats, but from the center of their chests. It was a resonant, almost subliminal frequency, the sound of a hive mind communicating with itself on a level he could not comprehend. They did not speak, for they no longer had anything individual to say. They were one being, and this was its voice. Jan sealed himself inside his shack, a hermit in a world of automatons. He stuffed rags into the cracks around the window and the door, a futile attempt to block out the sight and sound of the new reality. He lived on his dwindling supplies of dried fish and stale water, the gnawing in his stomach a welcome distraction from the gnawing in his soul. But the physical barriers were useless. The feeling of the celestial eye's gaze was a constant presence. It was no longer a pressure from the sky, but an internal phenomenon, a cold spot in the back of his mind that never went away. It crawled over his skin like 1,000 tiny, unseen legs. At night, the whispers came. They slithered into his thoughts when he was weakest, in the suffocating darkness just before dawn. They were not words, but insidious suggestions, feelings of profound loneliness and the seductive promise of belonging. The whispers showed him the peace of surrendered will, the comfort of becoming a part of the whole, of letting go of the painful, isolating burden of being I, and dissolving into the warm, mindless ocean of we. He would press his hands to his ears, but the voice was already inside, echoing in the hollow spaces of his skull. And every night, the marching began. It started just as the last vestiges of twilight died and the eye in the sky began to cast its sterile, white light upon the land. It was the sound of the town gathering, the unified tramp of feet on stone, but this time it was not the sound of labor. It was the sound of a pilgrimage. The rhythmic footsteps would converge, growing louder, marching past his shack, so close he could feel the vibration through the floorboards. They were going somewhere. Every single night, they were drawn to the same place. One night, the compulsion to see became unbearable, a burning itch of curiosity that was stronger than his fear. He crept to the wall, his body trembling, and pressed his eye to a tiny crack in the wood. His view was limited, a narrow slice of the cliffs that overlooked the sea. The moonlight was so bright it was like a perpetual flash of lightning, bleaching the world of color. And then they came into view, the entire population of the town, moving as one silent column. They arranged themselves along the cliff's edge, a silent army of the lost, their backs straight, their hands held loosely at their sides. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, their faces turned upward, bathed in the moon's cold, dead light. Their eyes were wide, and in the stark glare, Jan could see that they were not looking, but reflecting. Each pupil held a perfect, miniature image of the great, watching eye in the sky. They were mirrors, offering up their consciousness to be filled by the entity that commanded them. They were empty vessels, and he was watching their nightly communion, the ritual that recharged the web and solidified their bond. Then, in a final, soul-shattering confirmation of his deepest fears, they blinked. Every single person on the cliff, a multitude of men, women, and children, blinked at the exact same instant. Their eyelids closed with a slow, hypnotic grace and opened again, a silent, rhythmic pulse that rippled through the assembled crowd. It was not a human action, it was the synchronized, mechanical shuddering of 1,000 cameras, all pointed at their god. And in his dark, lonely shack, Jan felt his own eyelids grow heavy, an involuntary urge to join the horrifying, silent prayer. The sight of the nightly ritual, the silent, synchronized blinking of the entire town, was the spark that ignited the dry tinder of Jan's fear into a raging inferno. The whispers in his head were no longer seductive, they were the grinding of gears, the sound of his own identity being methodically dismantled. To stay was to be consumed, to dissolve into the placid, mindless ocean of the hive. Panic, cold and sharp as the sea in winter, seized him. It was a purely physical sensation, a jolt of animal terror that screamed one word: flee. There was no plan, only the desperate, primal instinct to put distance between himself and the unblinking eye in the sky. He moved with a frantic energy he hadn't felt in years, his hands shaking as he stuffed a few meager provisions into a canvas sack. A skin of water, a chunk of stale bread, his sharpest gutting knife, a pathetic arsenal against a cosmic horror. He grabbed an old, salt-stained nautical chart, not for navigation, but as a talisman of a world that had once made sense, a world governed by tides and currents, not by the whims of a celestial watcher. His target was the sprawling, dark expanse of the pine forest that bordered the town to the north. In his panicked mind, the dense canopy of the trees was a shield, a roof under which the eye's terrible gaze might be dimmed or even blocked entirely. Slipping out of his shack before the first hint of the synchronized dawn was like stepping out of time. The town was utterly still, a model village under a glass dome, its inhabitants sleeping their collective, dreamless sleep. Every sound he made was a sacrilege in the profound silence. The creak of his own floorboards was a gunshot, the scrape of his boot on a loose stone was an avalanche. He moved through the familiar streets like a burglar, flitting from one deep shadow to the next, his own frantic heartbeat the only drumbeat in a world that had forgotten how to have a pulse. The air was thick with a palpable sense of waiting, as if the entire town were a single lung, holding its breath before the first, unified inhalation of the day. He reached the edge of the forest as the sky began to lighten from black to a bruised, hopeless gray. The trees stood like a wall of silent, towering sentinels, their scent of damp earth, pine needles, and decay a stark contrast to the salt and brine of the town. To step into their shadow was to cross a border into another country. For a few moments, the illusion of safety was intoxicating. The thick canopy of branches interlocked high above, a vaulted ceiling that hid the hated sky. The path was a narrow, winding tunnel of green and brown, and the silence here was different, it was alive with the tiny, secret movements of the forest, a natural quiet that felt sane and real. But the peace was a lie. As he pushed deeper, the natural sounds began to fade, replaced by that same, expectant stillness that had haunted his shack. The forest was not shielding him, it was watching him. The way the branches seemed to curve inward, the way the shadows clung to him, the way the air refused to stir, it all felt conscious, a part of the same, vast intelligence. He quickened his pace, a cold dread seeping back into his veins. Then he heard it. A sound that did not belong. It was not the snap of a twig under an animal's hoof, but the soft, rhythmic scuff of a footstep on the path behind him. He froze, straining to listen over the blood pounding in his ears. There it was again. Scuff. 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 A steady, unhurried pace. It was not the sound of a pursuit, but of an escort. He told himself it was an echo, a trick of the trees, his own mind turning on him. He forced himself to take another step, and the sound behind him mirrored his own movement perfectly. With a heart full of ice, he slowly turned his head. Through the gloom, he saw them. Figures, emerging from the deep shadows between the tree trunks, their forms indistinct and wavering. More were joining them, stepping silently onto the path behind him. They were the townsfolk. And they were not walking. They glided, moving with a horrifying, fluid grace, their feet seeming to skim the surface of the forest floor. Their arms, held loosely at their sides, swung in perfect, gentle unison. Their heads were not turned toward him, but were tilted back at an unnatural angle, their blank faces pointed up at the canopy as if they could see the eye right through it. They were not chasing him, they were following him, a silent, implacable tide. He was not an escapee, he was a procession of one. The realization broke his paralysis, and he ran. He plunged off the path, crashing through the dense undergrowth, the wild, chaotic motion a rebellion against their placid synchrony. Thorns tore at his clothes and skin, and low-hanging branches whipped his face like angry, skeletal fingers. But the hive was not deterred. The silent, gliding figures simply fanned out, their unified movement adapting to the terrain, their numbers seeming to swell as more and more of them emerged from the woods. The sound of their footsteps was no longer a scuff, but a rising, rhythmic tramp that seemed to make the very ground vibrate, a sound that echoed in his own chest until he could no longer distinguish it from his own heartbeat. He stumbled into a small clearing and risked a glance at the sky. Through a gap in the canopy, the eye was there, a pale, malevolent disk in the gray dawn. And as he watched, it blinked. The moment its colossal lid swept shut, the forest around him reacted. In a single, impossible instant, every tree, every bush, every blade of grass swayed in unison, a deep, coordinated bow toward the source of their command. The rustle of a million leaves became a single, sibilant hiss, a sound of collective, dispassionate judgment. The world itself was a part of the hive, and he was the only foreign body, the only sickness to be purged. Desperation lent him a final burst of strength. He saw a break in the trees ahead and sprinted toward it, bursting out of the forest and onto a high, windswept bluff overlooking the sea. There, in the center of the clearing, stark against the sky, stood the old, abandoned lighthouse. It was a ruin, a skeleton of stone and iron, but it was his only hope. He raced toward it, the unified tramp of the hive at his heels. He threw his full weight against the massive, iron-bound door. With a groan of rusted metal, it gave way, and he stumbled into the musty, cavernous dark within. He slammed the door shut, its boom echoing up the spiral of the tower, and frantically looked for a way to secure it. He found a massive, fallen timber and managed to wedge it against the door, a barricade that felt both monumental and utterly futile. He collapsed against the wall, his lungs on fire, his body screaming in protest. He listened. The footsteps outside came to a synchronized halt. There was no sound of attack, no bodies throwing themselves against the door. Only a profound silence, and then, the low, resonant hum of the hive, surrounding him, permeating the very stones of his prison. He pressed his eye to a crack in the wall and saw them, a silent ring of figures surrounding the lighthouse, their heads tilted back. And he finally understood. They had not been chasing him. They had been guiding him. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a stage. The night inside the lighthouse was a black, suffocating eternity. Jan sat with his back against the cold, curved stone, his knife clutched in his hand, and listened to the hive breathe. The sound was not carried on the wind, it seeped through the thick walls, a low, wet, rhythmic exhalation that was both intimate and monstrous. It was the sound of a single, colossal beast encircling his sanctuary. The air grew warm and humid with this collective respiration, and the once faint hum of the town had now focused into an intense, mind-numbing drone that vibrated in his teeth, a constant, silent pressure against his sanity. Sleep was an impossible luxury. Every time his eyelids grew heavy, the whispers would intensify, coiling through the dark passages of his mind. Join us. Be whole. The voice was not a sound, but a feeling, the cold, logical pull of gravity, the seductive promise of an end to fear, an end to the crushing weight of being alone. It showed him visions of serene, thoughtless existence, of bodies moving in perfect harmony, of a world without pain or doubt. To resist was exhausting, a constant battle against a tide that sought only to pull him under into its calm, dark depths. The eye in the sky was no longer just watching, it was wooing him. In a desperate, primal act of defiance, Jan began to scratch at the stone floor with the tip of his knife. He carved circles, spirals, the ancient signs of protection he remembered from the superstitions of his grandfather. The screech of metal on stone was a comfort, a sound that was his and his alone, a discordant note in the hive's perfect hum. But his hand trembled, and the lines were jagged and uncertain. A small puddle of rainwater had collected in a depression in the floor, and he glanced into it. He saw his own reflection, but it was horribly wrong. It was his face, but overlaid with 1,000 others, the features of his neighbor shifting and blending with his own, a composite horror with his terrified eyes at its center. He recoiled from the image just as the silence outside was broken by a new sound. It was not a roar, not a cry, but a soft, percussive thump against the heavy door. He froze, listening. Thump. It came again, in a slow, measured rhythm. It was not the sound of a fist or a battering ram. He scrambled to a crack in the wall and peered out. The crowd was still, their faces upturned. And then he understood. They were blinking. 1,000 eyelids, closing and opening in perfect, violent unison, creating a shockwave of displaced air that struck the door like a physical blow. The old wood groaned, the timber barricade shuddering with each synchronized impact. The door would not hold. The rhythmic assault was a countdown to his own assimilation. In a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he turned from the door and ran for the only escape route available, up. The spiral staircase was a dark, winding throat leading into the lighthouse's head, and he took the steps 2 at a time, his breath a raw sob in his chest. The air grew colder as he climbed, the hum of the hive fading, replaced by the lonely moan of the wind whipping around the tower. He was climbing toward the eye, toward the very source of his terror, but it was better than being consumed by the body below. He burst into the lantern room at the top, a cage of thick glass and rusted iron suspended between the sea and the sky. And from this vantage point, he saw the full, horrifying truth. The town below was no longer a collection of houses, but a single, living organism. The lights in the windows were not random, they pulsed, a slow, rhythmic beat that matched the humming that now rose up to meet him. The people were not just standing in the streets, they were arranged in vast, geometric patterns, their bodies forming the components of some terrible, living circuit board, and at the bluff, the crowd surrounding his tower was the focal point. Then he looked at the sky. The eye was there, immense, filling his entire field of vision. It was no longer a passive observer. It was focused entirely on him, a predator that had finally cornered its prey. The black pupil began to constrict, a tightening aperture that drew all light and thought into itself. He felt a physical pull, a force that demanded he surrender, that insisted he raise his own face and join the silent, blinking chorus. His own eyelids began to feel impossibly heavy, his muscles twitching with the urge to conform, to finally give in and let the silence take him. His body was betraying him, answering a call that his mind still fought to resist. But in that final moment, as the darkness began to close in at the edges of his vision, he saw it. He looked past the terror, past the hypnotic pressure, and into the absolute, bottomless black of the pupil. And what he saw there was not a void. It was a reflection. It was a mirror, and in it, he saw a man. The man was him, but older, his face a roadmap of unimaginable sorrow and exhaustion, his eyes hollowed out by a loneliness that was cosmic in scale. And in this older Jan's hand was a bottle, dark green and sealed with wax, which he was just about to cast into a gray, indifferent sea. The truth crashed down on him, a revelation so vast and so terrible it was a form of annihilation. He had not received a warning. He had sent one. He was seeing his own future, a future where he had not resisted, a future where he had become the first, the patient zero whose lonely blink had broken the world and started the chain of perfect, mindless unity. The eye was not a god. It was his own, personal hell, a reflection of his own, ultimate failure, broadcast across time. The hive below him was not their creation, it was his. A sound tore from his throat, a sound that was not a scream, but a laugh. It was a wild, broken, utterly insane noise, the sound of a man who had seen the shape of eternity and found it to be a perfect, self-devouring circle. The hive below him convulsed at the sound, their synchronized movements faltering for the first time. A voiceless, psychic howl of confusion and pain rippled through the crowd. The great eye in the sky shuddered, and from the corner of the colossal orb, a single, glistening tear of liquid light detached itself and fell, a slow-motion meteor, into the dark ocean below. His laughter echoing in the glass cage, Jen took a step forward and threw himself into the light. He did not fall, he lunged, his shoulder connecting with the thick, salt-grimed pane of the lantern room. The glass exploded outward in a shower of crystalline shards that caught the eye's sterile light and scattered it like a broken constellation. The hive below flinched as one, their perfect rhythm shattered. Their blinks became ragged, their footsteps faltered, their faces, for the first time, twisting in something that looked like confusion, like pain. He was not just an anomaly, he was a virus in the code, a shard of glass in the gears. When the gray, wounded light of dawn finally came, he descended. The town was waiting. They stood in the streets, no longer in their perfect patterns, but in scattered, uncertain clumps. Their eyes were still empty, their faces still blank, but as he walked among them, he saw the change. In the center of each vacant pupil was a tiny, star-shaped fracture, a flaw in the mirror. It was his flaw. His crack. He had not freed them, but he had broken their perfection. He had given them his scar. He walked through the silent crowd, and they parted for him, a slow, wave-like motion of bodies turning aside. Their heads were no longer tilted to the sky, but were turned toward him, and from their slack mouths came a new whisper, a silent, desperate plea that filled the air. Return. Return. Become whole again. He ignored them, walking the path back toward the sea, his home. He looked up at the sky. The moon was a pale, fading scar against the blue, no longer an eye, but a wound. A wound he had inflicted upon the world by refusing to inflict it upon himself. And in this terrible, absolute freedom, he felt not peace, but a cold, burning rage that he knew would last forever, as constant and as merciless as the turning of the tide.